If you've ever heard that sound in real life, you never forgot it. Old truckers called it the Screaming Jimmy. And the name wasn't poetic. It wasn't a nickname they gave it to sound cool. It was a warning, a fact. Because when this engine opened up on a highway at full throttle, people miles away stopped what they were doing and looked up. It was the loudest engine ever put into a production vehicle. And for nearly 4 decades, it was the heartbeat of America's trucking industry. Then one day, they killed it. Not because it broke, not because something better replaced it, but because it became too much, too loud, too dirty, too uncontrollable for a world that was getting quieter and cleaner, and frankly, softer. This is the full story of the Detroit Diesel 8V71. Where it came from, why men who drove it would take a pay cut just to get behind the wheel of a truck that had one, and exactly how the government managed to silence the most legendary engine sound in American history. And there's one moment, one specific test that made even the engineers building this thing step back and realize they might have created something they couldn't fully control. We'll get there. The birth of a monster. To understand what the 8V71 was, you first need to understand what Detroit Diesel was trying to solve in the early 1950s. American trucking was growing fast. The interstate highway system was coming. Loads were getting heavier. Routes were getting longer. And the engines of the time, they were tired. They were slow. They ran hot. And they breathed hard climbing grades out west. Detroit Diesel had already made a name with their 2-stroke engine family. The principle was simple but radical. Fire every other stroke instead of every fourth. More power pulses, more output, more RPM, but also more heat, more stress, and considerably more noise. When they stretched that 2-stroke design into an 8-cylinder, V configuration, 71 cubic inches per cylinder, and bolted a Roots-type supercharger right on top to force air into an engine that technically couldn't breathe on its own. They didn't build an engine. They built a weapon. The blower, that supercharger sitting on top, it had a sound all its own. A high-pitched mechanical whine that layered on top of the combustion noise and turned the whole thing into something that sounded less like machinery and more like something alive, something angry. The first drivers who climbed into trucks fitted with the 8V71 described the same thing. The moment that engine caught and settled into idle, you didn't just hear it. You felt it move through your chest, through the seat, through the steering wheel in your hands. But there was something else those early drivers noticed, something the engineers quietly acknowledged and then just chose to move forward anyway. A flaw baked into the very design. And we'll talk about exactly what that was, because it matters for everything that came later. The culture it created. By the 1960s, the 8V71 wasn't just an engine. It was a reputation. If your rig had a Screaming Jimmy under the hood, you were serious. Drivers knew it. Dispatchers knew it. You could hear one coming from half a mile back on a dark interstate, and every trucker on that road knew exactly what was about to pass them. There were drivers, grown men, experienced professionals, who would specifically request routes that had trucks equipped with the 8V71. Not because it made financial sense, but because driving behind that sound, feeling that power climbing the Rockies with a full load, was an experience that got into your blood and didn't leave. Mechanics had a different relationship with it. Most of them will tell you the same thing today. The 8V71 was not a forgiving engine. It ran hot. You had to stay on top of it. Coolant levels, injector timing, oil pressure, ignore any one of those things, and the engine would just fail. The sound of the 8V71 was part of the identity of American trucking culture. It was the sound of a CB radio era, the sound of a country moving freight at 3 a.m. on empty highways. It was the sound that meant somebody was working hard and proud of it, which makes what happened next, and how fast it happened, feel almost personal to the men who lived it. The flaw they knew about. Now, that flaw I mentioned earlier, the 8V71 had what engineers called a runaway condition. Because it was a 2-stroke diesel, it didn't just run on fuel from the injectors. Under the wrong circumstances, a blown head gasket, a bad oil seal, anything that let oil or combustion gases into the intake. The engine could begin feeding on its own fluids. And when that happened, cutting the fuel did nothing. The engine would overspeed. RPMs would climb past the red line, past safety margins, and the only way to stop it was to physically block the air intake, suffocate it, or just get clear and wait for it to destroy itself. Detroit Diesel didn't hide this. They trained mechanics on it. They issued service bulletins. But they also didn't stop building the engine, because when it ran right the vast majority of the time, nothing touched it. And the trucking industry agreed. For decades, they accepted the risk because the performance was worth it. That calculation would eventually be taken out of their hands. The ban, for the end, didn't come from one decision. It came from a decade of pressure. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, emissions regulations started tightening. The Clean Air Act, EPA standards, state-level noise ordinances, California being particularly aggressive. The 8V71 failed on almost every count. It was loud, obviously, but it also smoked. Two-stroke diesels burn oil by design. It's part of how the engine manages heat and lubrication at those combustion cycles. Under hard load, the exhaust stacks would pump black, sometimes blue, smoke in volumes that turned heads and increasingly turned regulators into enemies. Manufacturers tried, they really did. Engineers worked on injector redesigns, timing modifications, filtration systems, trying to bring the 8V71 into compliance without killing what made it the 8V71. It didn't work. You can't make a screaming Jimmy quiet. It's not in the design. It's not in the DNA. By the late 1980s and through the early 1990s, fleet operators faced a choice to phase out the two-stroke Detroit diesel engines or face fines and failed inspections that made them uneconomical to operate. One by one, the screaming Jimmies went quiet. New four-stroke designs, cleaner, quieter, compliant, took their place. Better in every measurable category the EPA cared about. Here's the thing about the 8V71 that gets lost in the technical arguments. The emissions data, the noise ordinances, the runaway risk statistics. This engine meant something to the men who drove 3 million miles behind one, to the mechanics who could diagnose a problem just by the change in that scream, to a generation of Americans for whom that sound was the sound of work, of grit, of a country that built things and moved things and wasn't quiet about any of it. You can argue all day whether banning it was the right call. The data on emissions, on public health, on noise pollution, it's real. The regulations weren't invented out of spite. But there's a reason that when you post a video of an 8V71 firing up on the internet today, the comments fill up with people in their 50s and 60s writing things like that, "Sound takes me back," and they don't make them like that anymore. They're not wrong. They never made anything like it, before or since. If you grew up around these engines, or you know somebody who did, drop it in the comments. I want to hear those stories. And if you want to see us cover the other legends Detroit Diesel built before the regulations caught up with them, hit subscribe. There are more stories like this one, and some of them are even wilder.